Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, June 16th, 2023. Time for ending another week with the Friday show. Lots to choose from today, and I'm not going to make any choices. We're just going to fall into whatever we do. That's very likely, actually, how we'll end things today. Lots to recap, I guess, but it's still all about TFG, which, if you're being polite, is the former guy, but if you're being less than polite, is that effing guy. And apparently, American Bridge, I read this morning, has got a campaign ad series that they're preparing that is will remind you of the daily chaos of the Trump administration, such as it was, and just remind you of all the crazy things and how every day was, grabbing at your head 5-6 times a day because something unbelievably stupid had happened. And I don't know. I mean, I don't feel like I need that reminder, but probably some people do, and that's what they're going with under that effing guy is, I guess, the title of the campaign. So, pretty good. I'm glad we did our part in perpetuating the use of TFG following his exit from office, and yeah, it's got dual use, in case you didn't know. So, okay, there we are. Something for us to take a look at here and consider during the upcoming weekend. Let's see. Oh, I got to put this away. There are some additional stories flying by that I just wanted to check out, both on the Bird site and the other new good one that everyone likes, except is it because it's not owned by a crazy billionaire. Okay, well, let's see. Let me catch up with and keep an eye on the KITM hashtag to see if there are any suggestions for direction for the day. I don't think I see anything we've missed in recent days. Just kind of scrolling back to make sure we haven't missed anything horrific. Although, well, there is something that I miss here. But I might have to take a look at that off the air so I can play the audio of it. But Rebecca Roman's telling us that there's, who is this? The American Taliban type preacher here, Pastor Kent Christmas. Is that his real name? That can't be real. Kent Christmas of Nashville, calling for Christians to do what? Well, a little bit of what we thought we were fighting them there to prevent, to strap bombs to their chests. Really? Come on. At this point in time, it's just getting ridiculous. They're just walking straight into it at this point. Okay, I don't know. That seems a little outrageous. I haven't listened to the audio on this one. But, I guess, well, warning. I guess don't hang out with anybody from Kent Christmas's congregation. Now, that doesn't sound good, does it? There's a C in Christmas, so it's not, so it's the hard C sound, so it sounds like KKK, but it is in fact Kent Christmas Congregation. All right, weird. Anyway, the real point is that over in today's abbreviated pundit roundup, which I'll use as a launching pad for things, since we didn't get to speak to Greg all that much this week, hopefully recovering today. But, valiant effort in yesterday. We appreciate it. His roundup today begins with, well, here's the title for it, and I'm not certain where we're going with this one, but with Donald Trump, there's no second act. I feel like he's in his 15th act at this point, but all right, let's see what's up here. Basically, though, one thing I note for the record is there just was nothing going on outside the courthouse on Tuesday. We covered that fact yesterday, but here, something he added to his roundup from the New York Times. In Miami, the only violence from Trump supporters was rhetorical. So that's good news. Calls for retribution were plentiful after the former president's indictments, but the demonstrations proved tame, a possible result of the aggressive prosecution of the January 6th rioters. That could be. in addition to Matthew Rigdon's point, which he made the other day, which was that the people you would expect to be ringleaders and organizers of any actual violent protest over the indictments and the arraignment are already in jail. But the secondary message there to others who might participate in actual violence or who liked to threaten to participate in the actual violence is that they know that there's actually a pretty good chance that they will be filmed and prosecuted and sent to prison like people were for January 6th. I think so. That's probably a good takeaway from January 6th prosecutions, and I guess it has been taken away. But also, it's, again, remember, Greg tells us all the time, it is a tiny minority, especially of those who are so fervent in their Trump support that they actually will resort to violence, that you really have to have a mob of people around you doing the same. It's a groupthink kind of a thing. It's very rare, I think, that you'll find somebody who will just spontaneously spark violence in the middle of a crowd where nobody's doing it. Everyone's sort of looking around to see if anyone else will start something. And anyway, that's not to say that there's no danger of it. You got to keep your eye out for it. And, every time we run into these explosive situations of extreme violence, it's always a lone wolf, as it turns out. That may or may not actually be the case. They're certainly motivated by someone else and supported in their decision to go to spark that violence by others. But that's the terminology that gets hung around their neck anyway. But so there are some people who are willing to do that, but in the main, even among the tiny minority of people who actually still support Trump that strongly, only a tiny minority inside of that tiny minority are actually genuinely willing to start violence from a non-violent situation. All right, so let's see. What else can we round up? Oh, here's something we ought to check in on. NBC News, Nevada's fake electors appear before a D.C. grand jury investigating January 6th. Let's take a look at that story. Greg has excerpted the best part of it for our abbreviated pundit roundup. I like to do the unabridged version of things sometimes to see if there's anything else we can mine from it. But since we're doing a news roundup to begin with, let's take the juiciest part here. Even as Trump is set to appear in court in Miami in the classified documents probe, a grand jury investigation into the aftermath of the 2020 election is continuing in Washington. That, of course, also in Jack Smith's hands. Nevada GOP Chair Michael McDonald, a close Trump political ally, as well as Jim DeGraffenreid. Okay, I think we got that right. The state's party vice chair were spotted by NBC News entering the area where the January 6th jury is meeting at the Washington Federal Courthouse on Tuesday. So a lot of supposition going on there, but what else would Nevadans be doing hanging around in the courthouse in that particular area in Washington, D.C.? It's a pretty good bet. Okay, kudos to the news team who are able to spot and identify the Nevada Republican chair and state party vice chair. I'd have no idea, of course. Not that I'm a Nevadan, but I couldn't do it for you for Virginia either. So good work on their part. When asked about having to appear the same day as Trump's court date, McDonald joked to an NBC News reporter, "Not on my bucket list." Not a great joke. Apparently making a great joke to NBC News, still on the bucket list. McDonald had previously confirmed to NBC News that federal authorities seized his cell phone as part of the investigation. So that's cool, too. Not that I want my cell phone to be confiscated, but I didn't riot on January 6th or pretend I was a fake elector. So let's see. What else have we here? Okay, something from the Bulwark, although I don't know if we necessarily need to add that one, but Politico chimed in here. As indictments pile up, Trump's Senate GOP skeptics multiply. I guess from 1 to 2. His number of upper chamber Republican endorsers is equal to the number who say they want another nominee or who want to bar him from office. That's good news. Trump leads the field in Senate GOP endorsements with 10 officially on board and potentially more on the way, but some Republican senators are quietly making moves. 4 have endorsed non-Trump candidates. A couple more say they want a different nominee. Several others grimace when asked about his electoral prospects, and even some staunch defenders are staying formally neutral so far. That includes Senator Mike Braun, well, I think he says Brown, actually, of Indiana, a longtime Trump ally, who as of now will only say, I've endorsed his policies. An official endorsement, I have not. It's been pretty clear I'd like to see someone articulate for the Republican Party what we're going to do policy-wise, he added, who's Brown, who's running for governor in his bright red state. He said he wouldn't endorse one of Trump's rivals and is waiting for the former president's approach to crystallize. Yeah, so he's got nothing to say. He doesn't know what to do. In total, the number of senators who say they want someone other than Trump or who voted to bar him from office is equal to the number endorsing him. And while the primary won't be won in the Senate GOP, Trump's critics there represent a considerable swath of the party base, including donors who want a different standard bearer to take on President Joe Biden. It's interesting. I don't think anybody actually did, in fact, get it. I mean, I think they're talking about people who voted to convict him as being among those who voted to bar him from office. And it might likely have followed, given who those votes for conviction were. But they didn't actually get a chance to vote on a penalty phase in the end of the impeachment trial. So, whatever. We're taking liberties with that. What else have we here? Yes, we learned about that one earlier this week about Evan Corcoran being a vital witness against Trump. And New York Times has written that up, but I think we've covered the bases on that one. Let's take a look at this one. Sure, why not? The radical strategy behind Trump's promise to, quote, go after Biden. Conservatives with close ties to Trump are laying out a paradigm-shifting legal rationale to erase the Justice Department's independence from the president. Oh, that should be interesting. All right, so, I mean, he's already formulating his plans, if elected, Trump, to overtly politicize the Department of Justice, eliminate its independence, make it subject to the direction of the president, and that he would then use that to go after Joe Biden. Meanwhile, we need now first to have a Republican subcommittee in the House of Representatives about the weaponization of government, because we plan to do it. As always, every accusation is in fact a confession. So let's see, what are the pull quotes here? Trump telling his crowd, if there was one, in Bedminster. That's where he returned after his arraignment, by the way, to have a rally at his Bedminster club and whine and complain about having been horribly persecuted, etc., and then threaten the existence of American democracy afterwards. I will appoint, he, I guess, would say, I will appoint a real special prosecutor, not a fake one like the one that's going after me, but a real special prosecutor to go after the most corrupt president in the history of the United States of America. And for clarification's sake, he let everybody know that wasn't him. It was Joe Biden and the entire Biden crime family, Trump said at his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey, on Tuesday night after his arraignment earlier that day in Miami. I will totally obliterate the deep state, which I didn't do in my first term because I wanted to eat some more and play golf. So, I guess he didn't get around to it. Mr. Trump's message was that the Justice Department charged him only because he is Mr. Biden's political opponent, so he would invert that supposed politicization, you see. In reality, under Attorney General Merrick Garland, 2 Trump-appointed prosecutors are already investigating Mr. Biden's handling of classified documents and the financial dealings of his son Hunter. But by suggesting the current prosecutors investigating the Bidens were not real, Mr. Trump appeared to be promising his supporters that he would appoint an ally who would bring charges against his political enemies regardless of the facts. Oh, so that'll be good. I figure that will probably fix everything for democracy. And let's see. Some totally different topics. Okay, things to keep in the back pocket. Let's make our own tour around the subjects of this morning. And it's kind of a slow news Friday. And get to a couple other things that have been waiting in the wings. My brother Mark had a question that he posed this morning, and I think we covered things well. He was sending me articles about what was it? Oh yeah, I have more I can update on this too, about the expected difficulty in getting the very radical lunatic wingnut Republicans in the House across the finish line on appropriations bills, and just what that means for everything, for government shutdown, etc. And we did, touch on the subject when Joan was here, because she's already anticipating shutdown. But of course, 9 out of 10 times that she's on the show, she's anticipating a shutdown, because there's always one being threatened, because Republicans are crazy. But we got another opportunity to address some of that yesterday with a piece from The Hill. There's another one. There's some new developments. They're starting to talk to senators about what they think is going to happen. And so we'll return to that subject. First, we'll do that one, let's see, and then we'll address the second of the subjects. But I do have another entry from The Hill. I guess they're follow-up to yesterday's reporting that we discussed. This, I don't know if it was the same reporter or not. Mike Lillis is the writer on this piece. GOP unrest. Conservatives threaten to tank party's 2024 spending bills. Now, in pocket, oh no, that's right. I thought they may have changed the headline overnight, but it looks like it was the same one. So let's scroll down and take a look. Speaker Kevin McCarthy is seeking to appease his conservative agitators by targeting next year's federal spending at last year's levels. It's not going well. Remember, this is the demand among the Freedom Caucus types, if not actual Freedom Caucus members themselves or exclusively Freedom Caucus members. But the idea was they believe that McCarthy promised them, in exchange for making him speaker, that he would freeze spending basically across the board, and that fiscal year 2024's budget would adhere to fiscal year 2022's spending limits. The same, they would just revert to 2 years ago on spending limits for their budgeting. The long list of conservatives, or a long list of conservatives, left Washington this week. Of course, senators, they're already gone. This was written yesterday. They were out the door. They left, accusing McCarthy and other GOP leaders of using budgetary gimmicks to create the false impression that they're cutting 2024 outlays back to 2022 levels, rather than adopting the fundamental budget changes to realize those reductions and rein in deficit spending over the long haul. So I guess in this case, they're actually probably talking to House Republicans who would have made that accusation. The hardliners are already threatening to oppose their own party's spending bills when they hit the House floor later this year, undermining the Republicans' leverage in the looming budget fight while heightening the chances of a government shutdown. The internal clash would also be an enormous headache for the Speaker, who's already under fire from conservatives for his handling of the debt ceiling debate and faces intense pressure to hold the line on spending in the coming battle over government funding. He's not doing 22 spending levels. He's talking, what? He's not doing 22 spending levels. He's talking 22 spending levels. Oh, I see. Okay. Says Representative Andy Biggs, former head of the far-right Freedom Caucus, on Thursday. Talk is cheap, which is fine because he's a budget hawk and he's doing the cheap thing. That's terrific. You should be happy about that. But I guess they're basically saying he's mouthing the words but not actually producing a budget that sticks to fiscal year 22 spending levels. Remember, of course, that in between fiscal year 2022 and now, there was a relatively large spike in inflation and the cost of living, and most people's expenses went up considerably. Inflation is settling, and declining now, and that's good news. But the idea that what made the cut in fiscal year 2022 would pay the bills in fiscal year 2024 is a very dubious prospect. In fact, we know that it wouldn't cover things and certainly doesn't reflect any of the spending priorities. Certainly not of President Biden, but probably not even of the Republicans who are willing to spend money on things. And certainly, I'm sure the defense hawks will be upset about it, no doubt about that. Biggs and a number of other conservatives fear that GOP appropriators intend to use a budgetary tool known as a rescission in the drafting of their 2024 spending bills. Rescissions essentially claw back spending that Congress has already appropriated for future programs, allowing appropriators to claim they're funding the government at one level while actually spending at another. Okay, the hardliners say that mechanism will lead to higher deficits than they're ready to support. It's a good eye. I mean, it's not untrue, and it is a bit of a gimmick, but I'm not certain that economists would see it as higher spending, given that that money was appropriated already. I mean, essentially what they're saying is if you have appropriated, $10 million for program X to run, and it turns out to have only spent $9 million, you can claw back that, rescind that last $1 million that they're authorized to spend, and either spend it again, but not again, it hasn't actually been spent yet, or spend it on something else, or add it to this year's budget so you can say, all right, well, we need $11 million to make the budget run, in our view, run correctly this year for fiscal year 2024 because of, various things, costs of living, inflation, increases, etc. And so they'll say, well, here's $11 million to do it with. But it's $10 million that we're appropriating, which is what we appropriated in fiscal year 2022, but you only used $9 million of it. We rescind that last $1 million and add it on top. So you're getting a total of 11 this year, but the budget says 10. So that upsets them a great deal because, of course, they say, what? It will lead to higher deficits than they're ready to support. But, of course, I guess if you're adding up those deficits and looking at the federal debt, in fiscal year 22, you probably marked down $10 million being spent on this program. Only 9 were spent, but because you budgeted for and allocated and authorized 10, you probably put that down in your budget debt and deficit calculations. But that $1 million, it can't be rescinded if it was already spent. It can only be rescinded if it has been obligated but not spent. So I don't know if it really increases the amount of spending overall over time, but it wouldn't surprise me if they didn't really understand things correctly. Nor would it surprise me if I wasn't understanding it correctly myself, by the way. Anyway, to continue on, the idea of saying that we're marking to 2022, that is, targeting 2022 spending levels for 24, the idea that says we're marking for 2022, but we're going to buy up to 2023 marks with rescissions, just, to me, that's disingenuous, Biggs said. But who cares? He's an idiot about a number of things. Why not this as well? Representative Ken Buck of Colorado, another Freedom Caucus member, agreed. My understanding is they're going to use the 23 numbers and then through rescissions get back to 22 numbers. So if they don't get the rescission, then they don't get the 22 number, Buck said. The whole predicate is we're going to do this with rescissions, and then the rescissions don't happen, and then everyone says, well, that wasn't my fault. Buck said he hasn't voted for any appropriations bill in a long time, and without more drastic cuts and fundamental structural changes, he'll likely oppose this year's bills too. So that's one of the things that Republicans love to do is you vote no on all the appropriations bills when Democrats are in control because you have that luxury, and Democrats have to provide the votes to win if they're in the majority. And then you get used to that, and you get used to being able to tell your constituents that you oppose all the bad spending. You oppose all the good spending too, but But you say, I supported that in principle, but I had to vote no because of the bad spending. And then when it's your turn to actually govern, you're afraid to do it. You won't pull the trigger, and you vote no because that's the only thing you know. And you just blame the bad spending. There was some good spending in there, too, and I like that, and I support that. And I'll take it when they spend that money in the district, and I'll claim credit for it. But I'm going to vote no on everything anyway. Let's see. To go off the cliff at the 22 pace is not much different to me than going off the cliff at the 23 pace, he said. So, what's the difference? Why not just vote yes for the 23 pace, since there's no difference? Oh, I didn't mean that. The opposition is significant because Democrats are already up in arms that McCarthy is targeting 2024 spending figures below the caps he negotiated with President Biden in this month's debt ceiling agreement. They're vowing to oppose any appropriations bills that fall below those figures, leaving McCarthy with little room for GOP defections given the Republicans' slim House majority. It's our view that a resolution was reached and was voted on in a bipartisan way, and at the end of the day, any spending agreement that's arrived at by the end of the year has to be consistent with the resolution of the default crisis, says House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries on Thursday. But, getting Republicans to agree to that, that's something completely different. Otherwise, though, he asks, and quite rightly, what was it all for? And the answer is, well, to play the wrong music. That's what. I've pressed the buttons 3 times now, but I guess we finally got the right music going. We'll see if I can fix this in editing. Anyway, the issue of government spending, of course, has been at the center of this battle between McCarthy and his hardline conservatives, who sought in January to win a promise from the Speaker to cut 2024 spending down to 2022 levels, but question mark as to whether or not they got it, and if so, what it says and what the hell it means. Hi everybody, it's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. Right, thank you. Oops, hello button. There you are. Boy, everything's just going great today. Good morning. How are you doing? And welcome back to the show. All right, I was just looking at, I got an email notification of a comment. I tried something completely different yesterday. I'm not done with the Hill article, but perhaps we'll return to it. But I just was noticing I tried something new, experimented with something I stumbled upon yesterday, which is probably has been there for quite some time. The ability to post the day's podcast in the blog page that they provide you over at Patreon, which is not something I've done because it's been the podcast is available in 10,000 other places, and I assume that most people who have been listening to the podcast have obviously found a way to listen to the podcast without using Patreon. But I posted it there because what the hell, why not? Once I discovered that you could do it, and I'm sure they notified me, of it. Who knows? 10 years ago, as far as I know, it doesn't make a difference. But I went ahead and posted it yesterday. And thought it wouldn't make any difference in the world. But then I got a note in response from Patreon supporter, and I guess that's all who would be leaving notes there, Laura Holmbeck, who says, yes, thank you. And I wasn't really sure. I wasn't expecting anybody to even notice because I figured they were all getting their podcasts elsewhere. But I guess what happens is I didn't set anything up, but it makes sense for Patreon to be rigged up such that when you post something to your creator's blog, that it notifies all the people who are supporters of that creator, as they call me in this, if you're creating content, right? It will notify everybody who is signed up as a Patreon sponsor and probably email them that that a post was put up, and I don't know whether it'll tell them that it's the podcast or not. They went to check it out, and it turned out to be the podcast, and Laura said, oh, great. So here it is. So I guess what it ends up being is a roundabout way of delivering a personal email notice to all Patreon sponsors that the show has been posted. It's basically a delivery of the podcast right to you in your email, which I guess is pretty convenient, as opposed to saying, all right, well, I'll get it from YouTube or Libsyn or everything else, but you have to kind of sit around and wait for the thing to show up, and there's no way of notifying you when it shows up. I guess if you do an RSS feed, the old-fashioned way, you get a notice that way. Maybe some of the other services are like that too, notify me when there's a new posting or something like that. I don't know. I don't download my own podcast. I barely remember what I said during the day. I don't want any reminders. It's enough for me. I'm finished with it. I certainly have had very little cause to listen to the show again after I've done it, edited it, posted it, etc. So I just don't know. That's just not part of my day. It's part of yours. So maybe this is a super convenience. And I thought, oh, okay, well, this is terrific. Then as I was posting the morning post, the morning announcement post, basically, for today's show, I thought, oh, the stuff we keep down in the below the fold section, as we used to call it back in the day, of each post that has links to the different ways to listen to the show. I ought to add the Patreon way of listening to that list. And then, and even update the YouTube thing, since they asked us recently to create playlists in YouTube and put all of our shows in the playlist. So I'm not really sure why it would make any difference to anybody. I don't know anything. I mean, if I were a daily user of YouTube feeds, it might make more sense to me what the difference is. But I created this playlist. I put it in the list there, and I said maybe I should double check on all these things. Are they all still functioning? And they are pretty much, although some of the URLs to which you were directed are a little less direct than I wanted them to be, and I updated them where I could. But I noticed that the Google Podcasts page was the only one not updated at that point with yesterday's show. And I wasn't really sure what had caused that. Now I see a message from Tim Burnett who says, I was wondering why this episode didn't show up in Google Podcasts yesterday afternoon like it normally does. Did you decide to switch to making reruns exclusive to patrons? And I haven't answered yet, but I was thinking, I was in the middle of answering when I lost track of what time it was and that we had to come back from the break. But I'll give you the answer straight here, and then maybe I'll get and type it for the record later on. But there was no intention to withhold it from any other podcast distribution system. It might just be that, I don't know. I mean, I guess they're obviously linked in some way. And so Google Podcasts, I guess, doesn't have yesterday's show because it's here. And I don't know, does Google own Patreon or something? I have no idea what's going on and why that would do it. There was no effort to restrict the reruns to patrons, although, you know, at some point I probably should do that. But, you know, the information wants to be free, man. And I don't want anybody to not, you know, be able to listen to the show. But I guess but I thought yesterday it might be a fun thing for Patreon patrons to have at least at the minimum this exclusive-ish thing where, okay, now you'll get a notification of when a version of the show is posted, and we can just go pick it up with a click or two, as opposed to constantly checking Google Podcasts or whatever. But I didn't intend for it to not be on Google Podcasts as a result, and maybe, I don't know, is it more important that it be on Google Podcasts than on Patreon? I don't know. So we'll have to shake this, see how this experiment shakes out and figure out what to do. But that's another opportunity for those of you who are Patreon supporters to chime in and decide what makes sense or whether it makes any difference in your life that this thing would be available via Patreon or not. And I don't know. We'll have to see what everybody has, what the opinions are on that one. Oh, by the way, speaking of which, I guess I got notification also the other day as I was poking around on Patreon from, let's see. Who was it that chimed in on this one? I got notice that Patreon sponsor a newish Patreon sponsor who I had thanked for joining the crew on May 10th and identified as John Harding is in fact one and the same as our Mastodon pal and Morning Herald, John Shiflett. So that was good news to find that out and to connect those. Sometimes it's not always obvious, and it makes more sense to you when you do it because you know what's going on. But for me, is John Harding the same person as John Shiflett? No. One is Harding, the other is Shiflett. Oh, okay. You use both names. Various reasons. Don't need an explanation. That's okay. But it was good to know. I was glad to hear about that. Also, Andrew Warren, a new sponsor on June 7th. So I appreciate that. Andrew, I need to get you a special message because I believe it was, who sent me a note via Patreon saying, oh, I accidentally entered the wrong email address when signing up, and I'm unable to change it, and can you change it? And the answer is, no, I don't think so. I don't know how I would be able to change your email address in this. I'm not the system administrator. I don't know. I mean, maybe I do have that ability, and I can't find it either. It surprises me that you don't have the ability to do that because, why can't you edit your own profile? But I totally understand that sometimes these user interfaces are terrible and you can't figure out how to make things work right. But not only could I not change your email address, but if I emailed you in return, I guess, do you check that? I guess you would get who knows how this thing works. If I email you in return, no, sorry, I can't fix it, and use the Patreon system, won't it send the answer to that email address that isn't yours, and then you'll never see the answer? So I'm going to have to go on the show and tell Andrew that I couldn't fix it. And then I might find out that it wasn't even Andrew. But whoever it was, if it wasn't Andrew, you should know this. Also, thanks to two other current Patreon sponsors who have boosted their support of late. One on the 8th and one just the other day on the 14th. First was Martin Verelst. Is that right? Verelst. I'm sorry, I'm mangling everybody's names. And you can all give me pronunciation guides if you feel so inclined in the notes. But Martin, thank you very much. And Mike D, who has been, I think, a sponsor for quite a long time, boosting his support as well. I appreciate it. There's no feature here on the show for people who drop their support. I don't know what you would say about that, for one thing, and for another, it just seems like bad practice to tell everybody, well, Joe Smith is a jerk. He left. There could be very good reasons for why they left, and the reasons could be, well, actually, I was a jerk, and so they got pissed and left. So you never know. But also, yeah, it just doesn't seem, it's not an appropriate thing to do, I think. But, it happens. And so it's appreciated when those of you who are, haven't been sponsors join up. Those who have boost their support because, people leave after a while. It does happen. And, we appreciate replacing their support along the way. Okay, well, that has nothing to do with anything, but it does explain, for those of you who might be dependent on Google Podcasts for picking it up and who aren't Patreon sponsors, well, one solution would be become a Patreon sponsor, and then you'll get an email notice. I think that's not a bad idea. I think I kind of like that system. And then we'll have to just see how many people are depending on Google Podcasts in order to get the show and make the decision from there. All right, let's see. There was more to that Hill article about internal strife among the GOP for the appropriations fight upcoming. We might as well take a look all the way through that, because it's going to be, I think, the critical element of likely of Jones' coverage of what's going on in Congress from here on in. And this is going to stretch out all the way through January this time. So this is the traditional time for us to worry about it. Usually the rest of the country doesn't think about it until September or so, after Labor Day, but you can usually see these crises forming on the other end of the summer as they get ready to head out for an August recess, and you get some idea of whether or not they're really going to be able to finish their work by the time they get back. All right. Well, anyway, lots of budget gimmickry going on, and amazing every time how few members of Congress whose job it is to do this stuff and to understand it turn out not to understand the number of gimmicks and tricks available to appropriators. And they know them all. And they constantly fool the rest of Congress for some reason, because those guys don't pay attention to anything. All right. Well, let's see. The issue of government spending has been at the center of the battle this year between McCarthy and his hardline conservatives, right? We heard about that. They think they want a promise from him to keep spending down to 2022 levels. A reduction of roughly $130 billion from current spending. In case you were wondering, how much does government spending increase year after year? Cutting it down to 2022 levels doesn't seem like going that far back. Like if you were telling me I want to do 2010 levels, I could understand. But not 2022 levels, $130 billion difference. The conservatives were furious that, as part of this month's debt ceiling deal between McCarthy and Biden, next year's spending came in above that figure, essentially frozen at 2023 levels, with a 1% increase slated for 2025. McCarthy has responded by claiming the top-line figure he negotiated with Biden was merely a ceiling, not an objective. He's instructed appropriators to target 2024 funding below that cap, and Kay Granger, the chair of the Appropriations Committee, announced that she'll do just that. The Fiscal Responsibility Act is a top-line spending cap, a ceiling, not a floor, for fiscal 2024 bills. I mean, that's what caps are. I'm not certain why there was so much confusion about that. That's why I'll use this opportunity to mark up appropriations bills that limit spending to fiscal year 2022 top-line levels. But conservatives weren't convinced. Representative Bob Good hailed Granger for putting out the statement, but what I'm hearing, he quickly added, is that the intention is to claim 2022 levels and then utilize rescissions to take it back up to 2023 and claim that that's some kind of a victory. We need true 2022 levels, and then we ought to be utilizing targeted cuts and rescissions to go beneath that, not pretend 2022 levels plussed up with rescissions, he said. Matt Gaetz, when he wasn't molesting any children, said, had delivered a similar warning this week, saying the key issue is the paradigm around what constitutes 2022 spending levels. We don't think you ought to be able to buy your way into those spending levels with rescissions. We think you ought to appropriate to that level. Because if you're only able to get to the 2022 levels with rescissions, then the budgetary process is void of the programmatic reforms that are necessary, Gates said. It might make sense. I don't know. My concern with Granger's statement is that it seems that 2022 levels are a term of art rather than a term of math, he continued. I'm worried that Chair Granger's statement reflects a willingness to only get to 2022 spending levels through rescissions, which is not going to be palatable for my crew, whichever crew that actually is, and also who cares. Neither Granger's office nor McCarthy's responded to requests for comment Thursday, but what would they even say to something like that? The conservative criticisms have raised new questions about McCarthy's ability to keep the confidence of his restive conference while cutting deals with Democrats to fund the government and prevent a shutdown. And that time, I think, is over. I don't know how many Democratic votes there's going to be for deep cuts in appropriations bills. Probably zero. The Speaker has said the hardliners are being unrealistic about governing in a divided Washington, but his arguments have failed to make those conservatives back down. Nobody wants a shutdown, Gates said, but we're not going to vote for budgetary gimmicks and deception as a strategy for funding the government. Oh, okay. Well, my guess is that they eventually will. Okay. Or that they'll be replaced by Democrats, and then the Democrats who replace them with their votes will make the demands about how much spending there actually should be. And we'll see how that shakes out. Okay, so that I thought was very interesting. Another question, though, that Mark posed is impossible to answer, and so we just won't, except by saying there is no answer for it. Or the question for today was, if Trump is found guilty, right, we're going to jump ahead to him being found guilty in one or another or all of these cases, right? The real question, I think on a lot of minds, okay, so could you actually go to jail for this? Two answers to that. One, I don't know if you noticed about this at the arraignment, but the reporting on the arraignment shows the potential prison sentence for what Trump was arraigned for on Tuesday in Miami is enormous. There's a lot of counts, and B, they're serious crimes, and they carry 10 to 20 years in many cases for each one of the counts with which he was indicted. So, I mean, it's 100+ year prison term in the offing here if you sentence the harshest way possible. Of course, you could run things concurrently. You don't necessarily get a conviction on every count, et cetera, et cetera. Things can be modified. But the real question, I guess, is would they really would they really do the work to imprison a former president, and how would that even work, and can you make it work? And the answer is nobody knows, because no one's ever even had to contemplate doing this before. And it's unclear how something like that would work. And my guess is, I guess the bottom line question of would he, if he were sentenced, would he be in a federal prison? If so, I imagine it would probably be a very special circumstance and with very special security arrangements. And it may be that, he's in who knows where, in some federal prison, yes, but in his own wing, because it's not entirely clear that your Secret Service protection evaporates upon being sentenced to prison. I don't know. I mean, my guess is that they're not going to just release you into the general population of a maximum security federal prison and say fend for yourself. But on the other hand, I could also see, some scrambling to try to decide what to do with it. Like, you can't, how do you deal with this? Which Secret Service detail is going to want to stay with him in prison while he's, I don't know. So, it may be that it ends up being, well, you're on house arrest or something, or your travel is restricted. I don't know. I really don't know how they're going to engineer putting him in prison. So it's not entirely clear. If you don't end up in prison, or if that's not really a possibility on Espionage Act violations, then what's the hell's the point? And, maybe we're all wrong, and we were all pre-wrong, and Aileen Cannon turns out to be right here, that ex-presidents can't go to jail for violating the Espionage Act, even if you convict them of violating the Espionage Act. I really don't know how they're going to engineer this. And it's not clear that we're going to get an answer, because there's also every possibility that Trump just dies before we have to answer that question, or dies very quickly after we start to try to answer that question. He's not young. He's not elderly at this point. He's not in great health either. So, I wouldn't depend on that. You're going to have to work out an answer. But We don't know how it goes. We're just going to have to wing it and see what happens. This is never going on. What do you do? How do you reconcile federal prison for Espionage Act violations and Secret Service protection? I do not know. But that's a big question. We'll have to work that one out. That'll be fun. The other questions are more political. Would he lose any primary support? Yes, sure, some. All? No, not all. There are some who just refuse to believe it. There's some really deluded people out there who are totally buying into the line. And he's feeding that line. He absolutely used his Bedminster speech to just say, this is an unjust political persecution. Not only did I do nothing wrong, I'm not the one that's doing things wrong here. It's actually the other guys. We need to elect me to give me the power to imprison the people who are trying to imprison me for breaking violating the Espionage Act. It's really them who are the criminals in all of this. And by the way, if you elected him president, there will be legitimate arguments, well, not legitimate, there will be arguments offered in all earnestness in the New York Times and elsewhere that he was right all along, and really the entirety of whatever the deep state is needs to be arrested and imprisoned instead, and our understanding of what kind of espionage is illegal, i.e. the kind that and what kinds are illegal and what aren't. And it comes down to the kinds that Donald Trump does are not. And if he decides to do a different kind tomorrow, the kind that Aldrich Ames actually did, the kind that name your spy, it doesn't matter. It will become automatically not illegal the time Donald Trump does it. That's what he's arguing for. So would he lose any primary support? Yes, some. There are some Republicans who don't like the idea of voting for somebody like him. Well, there are some Republicans who would believe at the end, yes, a person who was convicted under due process of law ought not to be nominated for or elected president, and that bothers me, so I'm going to vote no. But will he lose support from among his most fervent supporters? Even then, the answer is yes. There's a lot of people in the world, even though there's a tiny minority who are hardcore Donald Trump supporters. Among them, there are lots of people, and among them, there will be some who say, I just can't anymore. But would it be significant? Probably not, but you're starting with a tiny minority anyway. And then lastly, could the RNC drum him out, quote unquote, knowing that he couldn't possibly win the general election? They'd probably be right about that. Could they drum him out? They could. I mean, it's a private organization, and they could make it part of their rules to say that if you are convicted or under indictment for something super serious or whatever it is, or just this individual thing, they could basically write it into their rules if they wanted to, if they had the will to do it, and say, you can't hold, we won't allow you to be the Republican nominee. That would, of course, probably for Trump spark a third party run, which would probably ruin everything for Republicans, which is fine. But yes, they can withhold their nomination from him. I just don't know that they have it in them to do that. All right, let's see. Other stories to address. Of course, we're coming up on the top of the hour break here. But it is time to, move on to other stories. Let's see. There's a couple of very interesting developments alongside this TFG story that we have to get to, and then some perhaps esoterica, but lots to do here. Let's try this one here. A Washington Post piece from Philip Bump, almost always worth reading. Republicans keep spilling cold water on their bribery allegations, their Biden bribery allegations. As you know, let's see, Chuck Grassley and James Comer are, I guess, professionally now Biden accusers. And we have gone over just how flimsy their accusations are, but Philip Bump has done a pretty good job at summarizing all of that and giving just a little extra nuance to that reading. And, let's see. This particular detail, I think, is of some interest. In early May, of course, House Oversight Chairman James Comer and Senator Charles Grassley claimed in a news release that the FBI had information alleging that President Biden took a bribe when he was serving as vice president. From that date until a week ago Sunday, a period of about 5 weeks, Fox News mentioned the claim in just over 200 chunks of airtime. That's a very awkward way of saying that. I guess during 200 individual segments were aired about the allegations. So it's not a total number of minutes on the air or whatever, but how many times did Fox News make mention of their claims that Biden had taken a bribe when he was vice president? 200 times since early May. Then, last week, former President Donald Trump was indicted on federal criminal charges. The number of mentions on Fox News after that topped 210 that week alone, and another 170 or so already this week. In part, that was a function of the FBI allowing every member of the Oversight Committee to view the document containing the allegation, per their demands, of course. In part, it was because the allegation against Biden served as a useful rhetorical counterpoint for the allegation against Trump. In other words, more whataboutism. It was not, however, an effective legal counterpoint, given the flimsiness of what's been alleged, and you don't have to take our word for it. A number of Republicans allied with Trump have similarly noted that the allegations are nothing more than that. We explained, I guess, I don't know, last week, maybe even earlier than that, exactly what was going on here. Is that, without getting into the technical names for everything, the FBI was approached by someone who, for whatever reason, decided to make that allegation and said, I want you to essentially take notes on this, as they do when they speak to any confidential informant. They wrote down that he said, basically that someone said, and you'll hear more detail about it in Bump's pieces. We continue it after this break. But basically someone said, I heard someone say that years ago they heard, something like that Biden had taken a bribe in thus and such a situation, and so you should probably take notes on that. They did take note on it. They looked into it to some extent and basically had to make a determination. Is this something we follow up on? To no one's surprise, the answer was no, we don't. And now Grassley says, well, everyone should read this thing where some guy says, 10 years ago someone told me something. That's it. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. Let's continue. Let me give you a Philip Bumps rundown on this in case that short version of it didn't make a great deal of sense. Right. Where were we here? Oh, yes. It was not an effective legal counterpoint. Don't take our word for it. A lot of Republicans have noted the flimsiness as well, including Grassley himself of late. Anyway, at issue is an interview recorded by the FBI in June of 2020. A confidential source who had been working for the FBI for some time, it's not just a rando on the street, told the Bureau about a conversation they'd had with a Ukrainian executive. Understood, thanks to interviews that news outlets conducted with Republicans who'd seen the document, understood to be Mykola, M-Y-K-O-L-A, Mykola, at least in English, or Roman lettering, Mykola Zlochevsky, the founder of energy firm Burisma. So you'll recognize the name, of course. Burisma, you'll recall, is the company on whose board President Biden's son Hunter once sat, after then Vice President Joe Biden joined with other international leaders in calling for the firing of Ukraine's prosecutor general, Viktor Shokin. Given his failure to address corruption, the ousted prosecutor claimed that he'd been fired because Biden was trying to block an investigation into Burisma, an investigation that didn't exist, by the way. Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, spoke with Shokin. Trump would later try to coerce Ukraine's president into announcing an investigation into Biden. and then hence the first impeachment. The 2020 interview appears to have followed from information Giuliani passed to the Bureau, as we reported. And so basically, it sounds like it was Giuliani who sparked the interest in the FBI in speaking to the person whose interview resulted in this allegation. So what basically means is Giuliani told the FBI, there's somebody I know of who will make an allegation of bribery against Biden. Will you speak to them? They said, we'll speak to them. The guy made the allegation secondhand. They wrote it down. And now Grassley and Comer are saying everybody should look. There's a allegation that was made. Rudy Giuliani told the FBI that there was a guy willing to make the allegation. They let him make the allegation, and now they're pointing to the allegation and saying, there you go. The FBI has notes about the allegation. That's all it is, but they're invoking the FBI has this, the FBI has that. And why hasn't the FBI arrested him already if they know? Well, all they know is somebody said something, and check out just how flimsy it gets. The 2020 interview appears to have followed from information Giuliani passed to the Bureau. As we reported earlier this week, Giuliani has reportedly spoken with Zlochevsky in 2019. And again, Zlochevsky is the founder of Burisma, or at least one of them. Okay, so Giuliani spoke with Zlochevsky in 2019, at which point he was told that the executive never spoke with Joe Biden while Hunter Biden was on the company's board. So there you go, right? Dramatic music. Nothing. I mean, Giuliani spoke with Zlochevsky in 2019, at which point he was told that Zlochevsky never spoke with Joe Biden while Hunter was on the company's board. So what's the issue? Well, the confidential source instead reportedly claims to have been told by Zlochevsky that the executive paid bribes of $5 million to each Biden, both of them, and that he has tape recordings of conversations with them. So just to get this straight, Giuliani spoke with Zlochevsky in 2019. Zlochevsky told Giuliani, I never spoke with Joe Biden at all, ever. Certainly not while Hunter Biden was on the board. Okay. But this confidential source says in the interview with the FBI, well, I was told by Zlochevsky, who subsequently told Giuliani, no, I got nothing for you. Giuliani, of course, is in Ukraine hunting for damaging information on either or both Bidens, whatever he can get, speaks to Zlochevsky, and Zlochevsky says, I don't know what to tell you. I never spoke to Joe Biden. But Giuliani also finds out there's a confidential source out there who will speak to the FBI, who will say, well, I heard that Zlochevsky said that he did bribe Biden and that he has tape recordings of conversations with them. Now, you'll notice, Philip Bump then continues, this is very thin gruel. It's the public understanding of what partisan politicians took away from a confidential FBI form documenting a conversation between the person speaking to the FBI and a third party several years prior. There's no other evidence. There's no tapes, no financial transactions, no nothing, and at least one competing secondhand claim from Zlochevsky pointing in the other direction. So at one point, Zlochevsky tells one guy, I never spoke with Biden. He tells another guy, or someone else tells a guy that he once told a third guy, oh, no, there was bribery, and I have tapes. Okay. Yet, as Representative Daniel Goldman of New York pointed out on Wednesday, this allegation, quote, is the only thing that I hear my Republican friends talk about outside this room. Comer, in particular, has made the rounds amplifying the underlying claim while mostly focusing his investigatory efforts on getting the FBI simply to release the unredacted interview record. But there have also been a number of occasions on which Republicans, including more Trump-friendly ones, have accurately pointed out the thinness of the allegations. There was Grassley, for example, who appeared on Fox News earlier this month to discuss the claim that he himself had first helped elevate the document, a Form FD 1023, hasn't yet been provided to legislators by the FBI, but now has been, of course. But both Grassley and Comer had already seen it. And then, of course, last week they let all the members of the investigatory committee see it, and then they all went on the news to tell people what it said, even though they weren't really supposed to do that. But Murdery Trader Green, of course, made a big deal of pointing out that I immediately exited the skiff where I read the thing and wrote down notes so that I could come on Fox News and tell everybody what this still confidential memo actually says. But Grassley was asked what the document alleged, but nearly a month after he signed a letter claiming that it describes an alleged criminal scheme involving then Vice President Biden relating to the exchange of money for policy decisions, Grassley instead said he was, quote, not going to characterize it, even though he had already characterized it. There's accusations in it, he added later, but it's not for me to make a judgment about whether these accusations are accurate or not. It's up to my job, well, it is my job, to make sure that the FBI is doing their job, which they were by not revealing it. But okay, Grassley would later offer more information. He was the source of the public claim that the executive said he had tapes of the Bidens. How do you like that? Grassley was the source of the public claim that the executive said he had these tapes. In an interview on Newsmax, Comer admitted that he didn't know if the tapes actually existed. I can confirm they were listed in the 1023 that the FBI redacted, Comer said. We don't know if they're legit or not. He added that we know the foreign national claims he has them, which itself isn't quite right. He knows the confidential source says the executive had them at some point before mid-2020, but that Comer wouldn't attest to the legitimacy of the tapes, including their alleged content, is important. In a Newsmax interview on Thursday, Senator Ron Johnson was asked about the purported tapes, that it is right-wing Newsmax that is so energetic about the idea that the tapes exist should probably not come as a surprise. Did they exist? We don't know, Johnson replied, like the P-tape, right? Senator Grassley's never said that they exist. Instead, he continued, Grassley has simply said that the source said he'd heard they exist. The day before, Johnson appeared on a conservative talk radio show. He reiterated that the tapes might not exist and that Zlochevsky might not be reliable. We don't know really whether the tapes exist. We just don't know that. Whether this was just a bluff on the part of the whoever the executive was, Johnson said. On Tuesday, Matt Gaetz, who gets in every article somehow, not a member of the Oversight Committee, discussed the issue with former Trump advisor Steve Bannon. I want to be very clear about something. Even what's on a 1023 is an allegation, he said in Bannon's War Room podcast. What needs to happen, he said, is to track down the bank records and look for all these 17 audio recordings, which he said he knew about several months ago. There are two important parts to this. The first is that the FBI was wary of sharing the 1023 in part specifically because it was an unproven allegation. The FBI could interview anyone about anything. That doesn't make the information gleaned from that interview accurate, particularly when being conveyed secondhand. The second is that Gaetz is right. The committee could and should investigate the claims rather than simply throwing them out on right-wing cable channels. If Gaetz knew about this for months, it's safe to assume that Comer and Grassley may have as well. Why didn't Oversight dig up evidence of the alleged bribes as part of its exhaustive consideration of Hunter Biden's finances detailed last month? So far, every claim about Biden and bribery in this context comes down to something someone says they were told by this source to the FBI after his discussions with the Ukrainian executive. In Goldman's summary, it's a 3-year-old, second-hand, hearsay, uncorroborated rehashing of Rudy Giuliani's bogus allegations that he got from a corrupt Ukrainian official. Even a number of Republicans aren't willing to vouch for it, much more than that. So there you have that. That gives you some context of what sort of allegation is really being made and what are what's the value of it. Okay, let's see. Another thing that I wanted to touch on and that I didn't because I couldn't find any write-ups of it until yesterday, but something I saw flashing across the chyrons the screen the other day, actually while I was in picking up some takeout Chinese the other day, and they had CNN on there, and they were discussing the fact that Trump had gotten himself into so much trouble in this Espionage Act case, largely because, I keep mentioning to you that Republicans keep insisting that somehow the Presidential Records Act is somehow a defense to this situation when it in fact, outlines reasons why he should be arrested for violations of that act. But the more serious violations are Espionage Act violations. But that Trump had come to the conclusion that the Presidential Records Act says that the purpose of the act is, as opposed to the purpose of the act really, which is that you need to preserve all presidential records. He believes that the main import of the Presidential Records Act is that what it says is that presidents can designate any part of the presidential records as personal records and therefore keep them, which is the opposite of what it says. I mean, it does have a provision for designating certain materials as personal, but they have to meet certain tests first, and it's only a small portion of what the act actually addresses. The bulk of what it addresses is the actual preservation of everything created from official acts and governmental action during a presidency. It's, 90% of it is about how everything belongs to the government and needs to be turned over to the government at the end of the presidency. And then there's a small part of it that says some things which are entirely personal in nature don't have to be turned over to the government. But it's a minor part of what they talk about, and it's the absolute opposite of what the act is about. And it doesn't get around the fact that most of the stuff will belong to the government. And no, it doesn't say it's at your discretion. It says, it's your discretion to make requests that certain things be designated as personal, but only if they meet certain tests. So it turns out that, one, he's got a totally erroneous view of things, and two, that this totally erroneous view of things comes from Tom Fitton, the head of Judicial Watch, who, it might be wise to remind everybody at this time, is not actually a lawyer. He just likes watching judges, apparently. Judicial Watch, fine, anyone can watch judges, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. And they do all sorts of things over at Judicial Watch. And you don't have to be a lawyer in order to be able to understand legal concepts. It's just that Tom Fitton doesn't. And as it turns out, he had an army of lawyers telling him, no, the Presidential Records Act doesn't mean that. It means the opposite. And certain provisions of various other archiving and record-keeping acts all say the opposite of what you think and what Tom Fitton thinks, and you're going to be in trouble with the Espionage Act if you don't comply. He said, never mind all of you lawyers, I'm going to go with the non-lawyer guy. I like his interpretation better because, it tells me what I want to hear. So I'm just going to say that's my legal advice. And now he's in trouble. It's quite amazing, really. And there's no way to put it beyond that except that, there's different turns of phrase that are of some interest. And I have a couple of people who have turned those phrases. As a matter of fact, from one of the community postings over at Daily Kos by, Merlin and then a bunch of numbers. Merlin, maybe 1963-57, I don't know, but 196357. What it all means, I couldn't tell you. It's fine, don't worry about it. We'll just say Merlin in this case, who writes, right to the point. Tom Fitton of Judicial Watch helped torpedo Trump's lawyers' efforts to avoid indictment. That was really the point of the chyron in the segment that I was watching on CNN. They basically said that Trump's lawyers and everybody else says these charges were eminently avoidable. When the NARA, National Archives and Records Administration, came to Trump and said, we believe there's a number of documents that you're in possession of that should be in the National Archives and in our possession instead, give them to us. Had he said, oops, yes, and given them to him, he would not be in trouble. That's it. When he talks about, Joe Biden took documents, Mike Pence took documents, and they're not in trouble. They did. They took documents. Whether or not they knew they were taking the documents is another question. Not even applicable really necessarily here. The point really is if you're found to have those documents, or you find you have the documents, and you give them back when asked, they tend not to make a big deal out of it. They can charge you. That doesn't actually absolve you of the possibility of being charged under the Espionage Act or any of the other Presidential Records Act for that matter. But they tend not to do it because why? They've gotten the compliance they want. That's what they really want out of people. There's no reason to charge them. And in fact, of the documents that were returned, remember the 15 boxes that Trump did ship back initially, and then even the 38 documents that were bound up in that red-welled folder and taped closed that Trump wanted to cherry pick and have Evan Corcoran remove really bad-looking stuff from, but he didn't do it, right? He's not charged with, I don't think, with any of the possession of any of those documents either. It's the ones he withheld that he's being charged for. So, I mean, the indictment itself validates that concept. If you cooperate and give them back, you won't be charged. That's why Biden isn't being charged. That's why Pence isn't being charged. Yes, they're being investigated because you have to investigate things just so that nobody thinks there's any favoritism. But the fact is, if you give them back, they tend not to charge you. So that's how you would avoid it. But instead, his lawyers said, give it back and then there won't be problems. Fitton said, no, don't give it back. It belongs to you. They have no right to take it back because Presidential Records Act. No, it's the opposite. But, it's like the same thing. It's like people, I keep making the First Amendment comparison, but even better would be, it's like when people said, I heard that you can't make me wear a mask because HIPAA, right? You're violating my HIPAA rights by telling me I have to wear a mask to enter your store. Remember that refrain from the height of the pandemic? And it's like, no, there's nothing in HIPAA that applies to this whatsoever. You're just making stuff up. But I printed a card that says that, and now you have to research. I don't have to research. It's not a thing. You're wrong. Just like that. Tom Fitton says the Presidential Records Act says the opposite of what it actually says. You don't have to give those documents back. On principle, you should refuse to. So he did, and now he's in trouble. Wow. So, as Merlin puts it, a man with no law degree told Donald Trump that he had every right to keep those stolen classified documents. The man in question is Tom Fitton of Judicial Watch. This group styles itself as conservative watchdogs fighting for transparency in government. But most of their attacks are filing frivolous lawsuits against Democratic presidents. That's true. And I grabbed Merlin's summary precisely because it gives this background. And of course, that great first line. Anyway, and while you might think the Judicial Watch employs mostly lawyers, Tom Fitton has no law degree. In fact, his major was in English. And it was Fitton who torpedoed attempts by Trump's lawyers to return the classified documents and avoid an indictment. Seriously, you cannot make this stuff up. One of Donald Trump's new attorneys, and here he's quoting from the Washington Post story. I probably put the whole Post story aside, but he's quoting from she. I don't know. Sorry about that, Merlin. No indication given in the story. Maybe in your profile. Anyway, one of Donald Trump's new attorneys proposed an idea in the fall of 2022. The former president's team could try to arrange a settlement with the Justice Department. The attorney, Christopher Kise, who appears to be the most competent of the bunch, by the way, wanted to quietly approach Justice to see if he could negotiate a settlement that would preclude charges, hoping Attorney General Merrick Garland and the department would want an exit ramp to avoid prosecuting a former president. They did. They wanted it, but no. Kise would hopefully take the temperature down, he told others, by promising a professional approach and the return of all documents. But Trump was not interested after listening to other lawyers who urged a more pugilistic approach. So Kise never approached prosecutors. 3 people briefed on the matter said a special counsel was appointed months later. But at that point, I guess there were possibly actual attorneys still counseling him about this. Or to take this approach. Since the National Archives first asked for the return of presidential documents in Trump's possession in February of 2021, and until a grand jury issued its indictment this month, Trump was repeatedly stubborn and eschewed opportunities to avoid criminal charges, according to people with knowledge of the case, many of whom spoke on condition of anonymity. They note that Trump was not charged for any documents he returned voluntarily. Interviews with 7 Trump advisors with knowledge of the probe indicate he misled his own advisors, telling them the boxes contained only newspaper clippings and clothes. He repeatedly refused to give the documents back, even when some of his longest-serving advisors warned of peril, and some flew to Mar-a-Lago to beg him to return them. They came to me begging, tears streaming down their eyes, as he loves to say. And one of these pugilistic advisors was Tom Fitton. Trump time and again rejected the advice from lawyers and advisors who urged him to cooperate, and instead took the advice of Tom Fitton, the head of the conservative group Judicial Watch, and a range of others who told him he could legally keep the documents and should fight the Justice Department, advisors said. You two should fight, Fitton basically said. Trump would often cite Fitton to others, and Fitton told some of Trump's lawyers that Trump could keep the documents even as they disagreed, the advisors said. In an interview Wednesday, Fitton said he dined with Trump, so that sealed it, on Monday night at his club, eating filet mignon with the former president one day before his first court appearance on the document charges. I saw him last night. He's in a good mood. He's serious, and he's ready to fight under the law. Fitton, who appeared before the grand jury himself and was questioned about his role in both the Mar-a-Lago documents case and the investigation into the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, acknowledged he gave the advice to Trump, but declined to discuss the details of their conversations, because of course he would be practicing law without a license. Anyway, he added that he read the indictment and did not believe it laid out illegal or obstructive conduct. Multiple witnesses said they were asked about Fitton in front of a grand jury and the role he played in Trump's discussions. I think that's what's lacking is the lawyers saying, I took this to be obstruction, said Fitton. Where's the conspiracy? I don't understand any of it. I think this is a trap. They had no business asking for the records, and they've manufactured an obstruction charge out of that. There are core constitutional issues that the indictment avoids, and the obstruction charge seems weak to me. Several other Trump advisors blamed Fitton for convincing Trump that he could keep the documents and repeatedly mentioning the, quote, Clinton socks case, a reference to tapes Bill Clinton stored in his sock drawer of his secret interviews with historian Taylor Branch that served as the basis of Branch's 2009 book documenting the Clinton presidency. Now, where's the conspiracy? Merlin says, it's in the damn indictment, you effing idiot. And they had every business to ask for those classified documents. I do agree with one thing he said. He really doesn't understand any of it. The stupidity just burns. It is really rather remarkable. They had no business asking for the documents. They were government property, but other than that, they had no business asking for it, I guess. All right. So a lot of that information comes from the larger Washington Post write-up. Trump rejected lawyers' efforts to avoid classified documents indictment. But rather than read all the way through that, I want to add more commentary to it, this time from Digby's blog, but written up by Tom Sullivan under the title Dumb and, not Dumber, but Dumb and Donald. He's the dumber. Okay. What have we here? We'll start off with some bullet points here. Former President Donald Trump left the White House in January 2021, obviously taking hundreds of sensitive documents with national security import, right, belonging to U.S. security agencies. Trump returned a few when asked, then willfully resisted a May 2022 subpoena and conspired to conceal hundreds of others he retained until the FBI executed that search warrant in August. So that is why Trump, who pleaded not guilty, he should have pled guilty, but pleaded not guilty this week, is under indictment on 37 felony charges. Not because he listens to idiots, although that is a factor, the Washington Post reveals, and they go over just what Kais tried to do and what Fitton undid for his part. But as it happens, a great description of everyone's efforts to get him to do the right thing and keep himself out of trouble. And it says here, Trump would not have it. Trump time and again rejected the advice from lawyers and advisors who urged him to cooperate and instead took advice from Tom Fitton. You heard all of that. Fitton just says outright you can keep the documents, but again, no law degree. Fitton convinced Trump that based on that Clinton socks case, which, by the way, Judicial Watch sued about and lost, that he could keep those documents. That argument is specious, to say the best, but Trump liked the sound of it anyway.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. Let's continue on with the Digby's blog folks' take on the Tom Fitton story. As you know, he's not a lawyer. Not only is he not a lawyer, but that didn't stop him from taking Judicial Watch to court against, I don't know who, I guess Clinton directly in the so-called Clinton socks case. I mean, that's the interesting thing, right? Well, you know, Donald, or Mr. President, I'm sure he calls him, you don't have to turn those documents over. I mean, just look at what happened in the Clinton socks case. He got to keep those tapes. I know. He got to keep those tapes. I mean, not because, but he got to keep those tapes despite your having sued him and claimed that he didn't have the right to those tapes. And you lost, which means you didn't really understand what was going on, which also means that when Clinton is in the White House, you think everything is a presidential record. And when Trump is in the White House, you think nothing is a presidential record. But the lesson, apparently, that Fitton learned from finding out that the Supreme Court, I don't know whether they actually ruled on the case or not, but that the federal courts consider private interviews by an historian about your time in the White House and what it was like to be president, et cetera, that aren't created by government officials and aren't created on government time and don't have any import in policy making can be designated as personal. The lesson from that is not, it's all the same sort of stupid, disingenuous argument. Oh, I guess that means that presidents can designate whatever they want as personal. No, a very narrow kind of record or document, a very specific type of document can be or other things besides documents can be designated as personal. That is to say, when they meet all the criteria that normal people think of as personal materials, then yes, they're not presidential records subject to the Archives Act, the authorizing act that creates the archives, whatever it is, or the Presidential Records Act, if that's not it. But there's something else. There are at least two classes of materials created by presidents during their presidency. Those that are official records that need to be a part of the archives, and those that are not. Oh, you mean there are kinds that are not? Basically, Tom Fitton walks away and says, that means there's really only one class of type of document or record. All of them can be instantly declared to be personal by any president because one guy once beat me in court by saying this is really just personal in nature, and the courts agreed. That's the lesson that he took away from this, and that just shows you what kind of an idiot you're talking about here in this Tom Fitton. So, the argument is specious, but Trump liked the sound of it. President Trump has consistently been in full compliance with the Presidential Records Act, which is the only law that applies to presidents and their records, Trump campaign spokesman Stephen Chung told the press. Of course, he hasn't been in compliance with the Presidential Records Act. He doesn't understand it. His only understanding of it is upside down and backwards. And no, it's not the only law that applies to presidents and their records. Plenty of others do. In fact, the Espionage Act does, and you're being charged under that, so what can I tell you? Except Department of Defense and Intelligence Agency documents, Tom points out here, not Tom Fitton, are not presidential records, and the act is not the only law that applies to presidents. So no, Trump is charged under the Espionage Act, as he points out here. It's a dumb argument, but one the twice impeached, twice indicted huckster thinks the rubes will buy the way they believe that he's a self-made business genius. So Trump is clinging to it like a life ring. His cult is repeating the nonsense at every chance, hoping to convince the public Trump is being singled out for persecution. Trump is being prosecuted for obstruction of justice and for willful retention of national security or defense information. And there are citations to the U.S. Code here, in case you're interested. There is not an attorney general of either party who would not have brought today's charges against the former president, tweeted retired Judge Michael Luttig, but he probably tweeted it very slowly, adding, he has dared, taunted, provoked, and goaded DOJ to prosecute him from the moment it was learned that he had taken these national security documents. And then, of course, there's the William Barr comment that even if half of what's in the indictment is true, then he's toast. It's a very detailed indictment, and it's very damning. But Trump is slippery. He has avoided jail his entire life by being rich and famous and litigious. Even now, the leading Republican candidate for president in 2024 is betting he can avoid jail at 77 years old. From another Washington Post report about him, we've seen this one quoted all over the place, quoting John Kelly saying he is scared S-less, S-less here from the Washington Post. His former chief of staff, John Kelly, says this is the way he compensates for that. He gives people the appearance that he doesn't care by doing this. For the first time in his life, it looks like he's going to be held accountable. Up until this point in his life, it's like, I'm not going to pay you, take me to court. He's never been held accountable before. Trump faces no charges for government documents, of course, that he voluntarily surrendered. So another good reiteration of that point. That offers up the opportunity to read from Mark Sumner's view of things, which is to say, as the headline does, this time Trump is in trouble. When Donald Trump was caught laundering money through his casino, he made a deal to pay $10 million and the problem went away. When Trump was caught defrauding people with his fake university, he paid $20 million and the problem went away. I mean, it's funny, too, because, I guess that's what the access to money and the easy money from having been handed money by his father means to him. Most other people would say, well, no, you did this thing, but you were fined $10 million. You got caught and it cost you $10 million. And this one, you got caught and it cost you $20 million. The problem didn't go away. The problem is that you lost $20 million. But for him, that's the cost of doing business, because he doesn't do any business, because he doesn't have a business, because his father gave him all his money. And maybe he didn't even do that. He sued some of it away from his siblings as well. And losing the money in spectacular fashion has been his vocation ever since. All right. When Trump was caught stealing money from his own charity, he paid a fine of $2 million, and the problem went away. The point is that the problem went away in the sense that I didn't go to jail. That's the only way I understand there to be a problem. And that's why this problem is different from all of his previous problems. All his life, Trump has been convinced that so long as he was able to pull a few more $1 million out of the family vaults, there was nothing he couldn't get away with. And he's been right. His deep pockets have allowed him to dodge and delay every legal issue he's faced. And each time agencies charged with enforcing the law, and each time agencies charged with enforcing the law decided they'd rather have Trump's money than justice. In the last 5 years, Trump has only gained an extra layer of protection, impeached for attempting to blackmail Ukrainian leaders into making false statements against Joe Biden, then impeached again for attempting to overturn the results of the 2020 election. Trump was never in serious danger so long as Republicans had more than a third of the Senate. Republicans have made protecting Trump not just a cause, but the cause. To a very large extent, the modern Republican Party exists to create a protective screen for Trump. Except this time, all the money, all the lies, all the threats, and every chyron on Fox News is not going to be enough. This time, Trump is in trouble. Considering the kid glove treatment Trump was given in his appearance at the Miami courthouse, it may not seem that way. When 25-year-old reality winner it's funny, I can't even say her name like it's a real name. Reality winner was taken before a federal judge on a single charge, by the way, of mishandling classified documents. The government argued that not only was she a flight risk, she was, quote, a threat to the public. Her parents offered to put up their house as collateral. Her attorneys offered to severely restrict her movements and access to the internet. The government was having none of it. Winner was held without bail until trial. Not so, I guess, here for Donald Trump. That's an interesting point, by the way. I was wondering about that and just imagining the conversation in the courthouse. I mean, this isn't, I'm sure, the way it went. But, I mean, well, Your Honor, just wanted to point out here, we have evidence, and it's listed and discussed in the indictment here. But there's evidence that the defendant absconded with several of the documents in question, loading them onto his private jet and flying them across state lines in order to frustrate the purpose of the government, which was at that point actively seeking the return of those documents. So, and then the judge would say, well, I'm inclined to release him on his own recognizance, to which apparently the government responds, that's okay, we don't consider him a flight risk, despite the flights that he's been taking and removing the documents with. But other than that, no flight risk. Okay. I mean, it is kid glove treatment. They don't want to, spark any unnecessary controversy or give anybody any, unnecessarily give anybody any reason to, rally to his cause. In all likelihood, he doesn't flee the country on his private jet between now and the time of trial. So that's what we have to depend on. But with Trump, there's no choice about having your photo taken when facing federal felony charges, except for Trump. There's no way that someone facing multiple charges of violating the Espionage Act would not see severe restrictions on their movements before trial, except for Trump. There's no way that someone with overseas properties, overseas bank accounts, and a private jet who was facing charges with a possible total sentence measured in centuries would not be considered a flight risk, except for Trump. Every time Judge Jonathan Goodman referred to Trump not as the defendant, but as the former president, it underscored that in spite of the seriousness of the charges, Trump's money and power are still shielding him from the treatment that would have been received by any other person standing in the docket, or in the dock, really. But at any rate, it would be easy to believe that somewhere around December 2024, after the next election has been decided and a dozen different appeals have been made, the government would simply put out its hand and take another check from Trump and let the whole thing go away. That's not going to happen, says Mark, because this time, even those who most want to protect Trump can see the truth of the indictment documents. This time, he effed up. When the announcement came out that Trump was to be indicted by the Miami grand jury, seated by special counsel Jack Smith, Republicans did their one job. They rushed to Trump's defense. From Jim Jordan to Marjorie Taylor Greene to Josh Hawley, they dragged out the expected screams of indignation and reached truly mesmerizing heights of whataboutism as they threatened to indict everyone who had so much as registered as a Democrat. Then the actual indictment was unsealed, and the protests became distinctly muted. It wasn't just an instantly memeable image of the bathroom stocked with boxes of classified documents. It was 40 pages of absolutely damning incidents in which Trump, given every opportunity to do the right thing, did the wrong thing. Then he did the wrong thing on tape. Then he explained that he knew he was doing the wrong thing on tape. Somewhere out there, a lot of new desks are being ordered for Republican offices to replace all the ones that got damaged by the head pounding. As the Washington Post reports, Trump's attorneys tried to broker a way out of all this over a year ago. They knew just what the kid glove treatment in Miami demonstrated again. If the Justice Department could find a way to let Trump off, they would let him off. They urged Trump to just hand over what he had and put an end to it. The evidence that this would have worked and wouldn't even have required Trump to cut a check is abundant and obvious. Not one of the charges on Trump's indictment has anything to do with a document that was voluntarily returned. That's true of the hundreds of classified documents that were in the boxes handed over to the National Archives in January of 2022, after nearly a full year of resistance. That's true of the additional folio of documents Trump's attorneys handed over in June of that year, after first claiming that there were no more documents in Trump's possession. Every single charge comes from a document that Trump not only refused to provide, but went out of his way to deny he was holding. He lied to the FBI, he lied to his own attorneys, he lied to everyone. And in an excerpt from, the Post, interviews with 7 Trump advisors with knowledge of the probe indicate he misled his own advisors, telling them the boxes contained only newspaper clippings and clothes. He repeatedly refused to give the documents back, even when some of his longest-serving advisors warned of peril, and some flew to Mar-a-Lago to beg him to return them. We heard that earlier. The saying, "It's not the crime, it's the cover-up," may seem trite, but in this case, it's doubly true. If Trump had listened to his attorneys, he'd be in the clear. If Trump had admitted to having the documents and given them back, he'd be in the clear. Hell, if Trump had fessed up after the FBI search of Mar-a-Lago and simply said he thought he had them and all, and had made a mistake, there would have not been an indictment. Trump has had stupendous, illogical, unlawful, and almost endless opportunities to get out of this, opportunities that would have been given to no one else. The DOJ would have taken any excuse not to indict Trump, but this time Trump only took all that extra rope and fashioned it into an extra long necktie, and he made it impossible to simply let him go. This morning, the Washington Post is wondering if Trump body man Walt Nauta is going to flip and testify against his boss. It's possible. Nauta was clearly acting on Trump's orders when he hauled those boxes out of the storeroom and lined them up for Trump's perusal. His lie to the FBI was clearly done with the intent of protecting his boss. If Nauta flipped, it would be another solid nail in Trump's coffin. It's possible, but it's not necessary. What's already in the indictment is more than sufficient to see Trump convicted. This isn't to say that the DOJ won't reach some kind of a deal with Trump. There's no doubt they would love to be going on to other cases. There was that guy who tried to overturn the election and incite violence. What was his name again? Yeah, there's also no doubt that a conviction for Trump won't mean what it did for ordinary citizens like Winner or a retired Army lieutenant who did the same thing, or an NSA contractor. but I guess Snowden, but it's not going to be signing a check this time. These charges are serious, and conviction on even one of them is going to result in at least a period of probation and severely restricted movement. Conviction on multiple charges is going to mean prison time. Then Hawley and Jordan and Green can scream even louder. It won't help Trump. Well, very likely not. By the way, there's also news today, actually yesterday, but I guess we'll just put it on the record. It's, I guess, a further illustration of this problem and this division, the two Americas, if you will. The latest from the New York Times, or at least one article from the New York Times, the airman who leaked files is indicted on charges of mishandling secrets. Jack Teixeira, who's we found out about a couple of weeks ago, now 21, could face up to 60 years in prison after being indicted on 6 counts of retaining and transmitting classified national defense information. So I don't know whether he's perhaps out on bond or not, but it seems once again that he's getting harsher treatment by far than Trump did. So, to be expected, I guess. But that's the news. Glenn Thrush reporting it, actually, for the Times here. A federal grand jury on Thursday indicted Teixeira, Massachusetts Air National Guardsman, who posted dozens of secret intelligence reports and other sensitive documents on a social media server on 6 counts of retaining and transmitting classified national defense information. No surprises here. 60 years in prison in the offing. You know the background of the story. Let's see, any word on what happened to him pending trial? Garland, involved in the case, of course, accuses Teixeira on Thursday of violating his oath to safeguard national security and said the leaking of the material was likely to have caused exceptionally grave damage to national security. Teixeira's lawyers did not respond to requests for comment. Let's see. Anything new here? Not so far. Do we get any word here what happens to him pending trial? Let's see. Teixeira remained in federal custody after prosecutors presented evidence that he had a history of making violent and racist threats. So does Trump. And had access to an arsenal of weapons, and Trump may as well, and represented a risk of sharing sensitive information with foreign countries. It all applies to Trump, pretty much. The most detailed accounts of his behavior came to light in a memo filed by the Justice Department's National Security Division arguing for his indefinite detention in April. The memo claimed that Teixeira repeatedly tried to obstruct federal investigators. What? No. And might still have information that would be of tremendous value to hostile nation states. That sounds like Trump, too. Prosecutors pointedly questioned Teixeira's overall state of mind, gee whiz, disclosing that he was suspended from high school in 2018 for alarming comments about the use of Molotov cocktails and other weapons, and trawled the internet for information about mass shootings. He engaged in regular discussions about violence and murder on Discord, the filing said, and he surrounded his bed at his parents' house with firearms and tactical gear. Gee whiz. Well, that's, what can I tell you? It's not at all like Trump. It's just, if you're not rich and you're not the former president, I guess they actually treat you rather harshly under normal circumstances. So there you go. It's still going on contemporaneously, in case you were wondering whether that was just something we recently decided to get rid of. It's not. All right. Let's see. What else have we got here that we might want to sneak in under the wire for the weekend? I don't know. I think that about covers it with all of that stuff. We could go back to, there's a Hill article, and I think Mark sent me this one too, that quotes a couple of Senate Republicans who are worried about the House's weird fixation on the nuances of the deal and the budget terms of art that are being used here, saying, yeah, it could in fact wind up being a fairly significant problem that ends up leading to a shutdown. Shall we see who's speaking out on the record on these things? Let's see. Perhaps we can skip down past the setup. Oh, well, here we are. The news both outraged Democrats and landed like a thud with GOP appropriators in the Senate, leaving them to scramble to get a funding bill through Congress before the end of September, although I thought they had given themselves to January to avoid the triggered 1% across the board cuts at the very least. But the shutdown comes in October, whether or not there's a triggering of the 1% cuts. You should remember that as well. It's going to be a problem, said Senator Shelley Moore Capito. Is that how we decided she says her name in West Virginia? The number 5 Senate Republican and an Appropriations Committee member. I don't want to co-opt what Senator Collins might say, who I guess is the number 1 on the Appropriations Committee there, but as Republicans go. But we struck an agreement that will write to those numbers. We'll go into a collaborative conference and try to hash it out, but I don't think it's going to be easy. Okay, anything a little more dramatic than that? The Senate has 8 working weeks between now and the end of September before a spending deal is needed, with the annual month-long August recess sandwiched in between. In total, the decision to put the bills together at the 2022 levels would represent, in their view, in this article, a $120 billion haircut versus the $130 billion earlier cited. That Democrats in both chambers and most Senate Republicans are not at all prepared to swallow. A number of Senate Republicans were already upset that the debt ceiling agreement will likely not allow for an increase in defense spending in any 2024 funding deal, and the possibility of even greater cuts is making the road to an agreement even more treacherous than before. Let's see. Senator Bill, is it Hagerty from Tennessee? A guy I never hear about. I'm not concerned that we lack the capacity to do it, but we will have to have the will to get on it. Oh boy, that's super insightful. Anybody else? John Thune saying, I think there's an incentive for both sides to try and get to a deal even though it's going to be really hard. Ooh, also super insightful. So basically, no. I think maybe we jump out of this article and say, all right, Senate Democrats or Senate Republicans are aware of the fact that House Republicans are going to make things extraordinarily difficult, and it doesn't look like, even if they manage to get a bill through the House, the Senate is going to agree, and the odds of a shutdown are greater now than, I don't know, than they were thought to be in the days after the deal was reached, I guess is all we can say. But basically, we're back to the same default. Whenever there are Republicans in partial control of anything in Congress, either house, there's substantial likelihood of government shutdown because that's just what they do. They create these problems. Okay, so let's see. No time left for the returning to any of the threatened return to any of the long reads that we never finished. So why not make things worse by starting a long read, another one that there's no chance that we could ever finish. So there are 2 that we could go with. Why not? Gosh. Well, there's only one that's still relevant, and it's the much longer of the 2. But let me at least mention it so that it's something you could perhaps read on over the weekend. And it's a long weekend, too, for many of you. Juneteenth falls on Monday, the new federal holiday, the newest. And if you have the good luck to be off for that day, well, then I guess you could spend it listening to the podcast, because we'll likely be on the air, as we are for several different fun and exciting federal holidays, and keeping you company during the day. All right, so here's something that you could read for yourself that looks to be a tremendous piece from Just Security, where everything is a long read. The other one is a little bit less relevant, the Mother Jones piece about the weird... how do they put it? I'll give you the headline, and I'll just give you the headline of this piece, too, because that's all I'll have time for in the end. John Durham's report used sketchy intelligence that might be itself Russian disinformation, a Mother Jones report that we never did get around to discussing. But because that's less relevant than the still existing case that Alvin Bragg has brought against Donald Trump, I thought I'd tip you off to the fact that there is an article that you could read in your spare time that will discuss the untold strength of tax crimes in Manhattan DA's case against former President Trump. And part of a long, not only a huge article, but a series of articles. And I won't even get through all of the names on the byline for this one, for this May 24th piece. That's how long I've been holding this thing. Paula Younghans, Norman Eisen, Sivan Watt, Joshua Stanton, and Fred Wertheimer. Eisen and Wertheimer writing together a lot these days. Just give you the opening paragraph here. Just last month, now 2 months ago. Well, no, I guess it's April, yes. So this was written in May. Just last month would have been April. A former President Donald Trump, Donald Trump, there we go, was arraigned on an indictment for 34 felony false books and records charges in New York. Because those charges are felonies, and because it's time for us to roll our outro music, I hit the button. Because those charges are felonies, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg is required to prove that the falsifications were made with the intent, quote, to commit, aid, or conceal another crime. You remember that whole thing? Yes. As expected, Bragg pointed to the federal and state campaign finance violations as those possible other crimes, but a surprise came when Bragg also suggested that the tax violations may serve as a basis for this felony bump up. His statement of facts declared that the participants also took steps that mischaracterized for tax purposes the true nature of the payments made in furtherance of the scheme. Now that suggestion has been confirmed in his response on May 16th to Trump's request for a bill of particulars. Tax crimes are among the possible crimes Bragg will pursue as a predicate to bump up the charges against the former president. But you remember the whole idea that there had to be some crime cover-up aspect to what he was charging in order to make these charges stick, and the word was that they would be campaign finance crimes. Apparently, tax avoidance crimes will count too. So perhaps you want to spend some time over the weekend reading up on this. I ought to, and then maybe we can digest it. But in the meantime, would you like some more to digest? Well, you've come to the right place, because the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy comes up next.
From netrootsradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
All right, what's on tap? The Bedminster Mystery has some grave implications that Jack Smith has already dug into if he brings charges from New Jersey. Also, a bipartisan Senate bill would seize the paychecks of executives overseeing failed banks. Wow, that sounds pretty interesting too. Plus more on the PGA Live Golf merger as well. Stay tuned. See you next week.